Hi, welcome to Say It Like You Play It, the podcast about games, language and culture.
I am Dr. Ibby. I am a linguist and I like playing games.
And I'm Dr. Joe. I am a game designer who knows how to speak a language.
No.
Okie dokie.
Let's get
And today we are going to be focusing on a game that is one of the most popular games in the world, but doesn't usually involve a computer, although more recently it has done. We're going to be looking at Dungeons and Dragons and how it handles languages. I am a game designer who plays Dungeons and Dragons sometimes and runs campaigns, and RPGs are one of my favourite genres of video games. I am not the person with a linguistics background, so I'm going to be interested to hear what Ibby has to say about some of these things.
Yeah, just to preface, I'm not an expert in constructed languages. So,
What does that mean?
well, a constructed language is, I would say, a language that is made up.
A fake language.
Although keeping in mind that all languages are made up to some degree. But it's basically a language where someone has sat down for whatever reason and has decided, okay, I'm going to make a language from scratch now. Yeah, that's what we have in D&D. That's what we have in all kinds of fictional worlds. If we think about Elvish in The Lord of the Rings, for instance, Klingon, and the most well-known sort of real-life example that doesn't come from a fictional world is probably Esperanto, which was invented with the idea that it would be a good lingua franca, so a sort of language that we can use to communicate globally, and a language that everyone would have to learn, in contrast to, English, which is the lingua franca now, or back in the day, it was French to some degree, and then it was Latin for some degree as well. Yeah.
Depending on where you got colonised.
Yeah, and when.
So we had Esperanto, which didn't catch on.
No.
It was like the fetch of the language world. Stopped trying to make Esperanto happen. And at some point, Tolkien made Elfsperanto.
Yeah.
I think there was a complete language for orcs as well, called the Black Speech for the Orokai.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And I don't know if there are fantasy authors before Tolkien that ever created a whole language, but that's the one that always gets brought up as being like the first example of someone doing it.
And yes, and it was, quite detailed, the way he did it.
So just to give a sense of how languages work in D&D for anyone who hasn't played the game. So if you've never played Dungeons and Dragons, you'll be familiar at least with things like Stranger Things and seeing other people play it, where you kind of sit around a table and use your imagination to varying degrees, and your characters are based on kind of numerical values for what that character knows, which helps to create a separation between the player and the character they're playing. So you can be a not very smart person in real life and then be playing a wizard who's very good at history or something like that. And languages kind of fall into that. They fall into one of these sets of skills that your character can know about, and there are all different sorts of languages within that setting. And in terms of how players come across that information, there's a Dungeon Master's Guide and a Player Handbook, which are two of the main sources of information about how to play this game. And that's where the kind of information on these languages are listed. And we're going to kind of go through and pick out some that are particularly interesting or fun, I guess, from a linguistic standpoint. But I think, first off, we should just look at how they're done in general, because I think it's interesting to see what's put in and what's left out in most cases, because they are not sort of Tolkien-esque Elfsperanto languages where someone has actually constructed the language, right? They've just kind of given us the rough idea of each one.
Yes, it's more the sort of history and rough description of a language, rather than, the rules of the grammar and all of that.
Yeah, so some languages belong to a particular race, which they've actually, in the new update, 5th edition, they've changed the language from race to species, finally, because the things that were referred to as races weren't races. They weren't ethnicities of the same sorts of people. They were completely different species. Obviously, it's a bit more complicated than that because you get orcs who can have a child with a human and make a half-orc. It's all very strange, and the whole weird eugenics of fantasy worlds is not something we can get into in depth now, but there are some languages on here, like top of the list, because it's in alphabetical order. We've got Aarakocra, which is the language of the bird people. They used to be a kind of standard species that you could always play as, but they took them out, and I think that was because it's really annoying to try and DM a game where someone can fly, and they're constantly putting armor on and taking armor off so that they can fly up and look in windows and stuff. So it says, Aarakocra is the language for the birds and can be extremely difficult for a non-beaked creature to reproduce.
That makes sense.
Yeah, as you would expect, right? The language is notable in the fact that it has many ways of saying the same thing depending on the speaker's mood. The same thought can be expressed in a loud, shrill tone or a delightful tune of bird calls. So it's kind of telling us about the phonetics of the language, right? And what it sounds like audibly, because there is an appearance bit underneath that's about the script as well.
Yes, so obviously what kind of, let's say, spoken language a creature can produce is very much dependent on the physical makeup of the organs that can produce that, right? So we make lots of different sounds by how our mouths are positioned, and specifically how our tongue is positioned in our mouth as, you know, humans. And if we have a race that is beaked, and I don't know if they would have tongues or not, but you know, it limits what they can do. They can't shape their beaks in different ways, right? So we get a sort of bird song. We know what birds sound like. So you know, that limits what kind of things they can communicate.
I feel like it should be obvious that birds have tongues, but now you've made me doubt it, and now I'm going to start Googling whether birds have tongues, but I
think maybe they do.
And then it talks about the script being like effectively written with a claw, which is again quite a cool consideration, because if you had a claw, you would have a writing implement with you, although I can imagine that would be potentially painful or break down after a while. Yeah, I was thinking that one of the things that always strikes me when you have like animal-based creatures in these things is that they can obviously talk in English or whatever the standard language of the setting is, which in D&D is referred to as common, which is like their escape route for if French players are playing it, then common is French, and if English players are playing it, then and so
common really just means whatever is the lingua franca.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. But it's kind of, when you get really pedantic about it, you start to think, okay, why would a character with a beak be able to speak in the common, and why would a character with a tiger's head be able to speak in the common? But then we know there are birds in the rainforest that can imitate sounds to a like incredible degree, like make it sound like a playground full of children playing, and we know that cats imitate human baby sounds to a degree. Which is funny, because then I imagine these kind of cat-based characters, and instead of having kind of normal timbre human voices, they all sound like babies when they speak. Which some people would probably like to role play, but it would be really, really irritating to me if everyone's cat characters like to talk like this all the time.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah,
I was just thinking about the actual written script of that bird race, which, you know, basically it is they use their. Is it claws? Is it talons? What is the... Yeah,
it's implied that the script is at least developed to use their claws. I suppose they might have other tools to make it easier, but...
Yeah. Which, you know, reminds me a lot of cuneiform, which is, you know, one of the oldest forms of writing, and I'm sure a lot of people might have seen this before, where you have sort of clay tablets, and then you use some kind of tool to push sort of wedge shapes into that, and that is how the writing evolves. But if you have claws, then you don't even need a tool, right? You can just do it without that.
You can sort of imagine how, you know, like on a keyboard, we have a layout that is based on the mechanics of the hand and the relative frequency of different letters in the alphabet and stuff. You can imagine how the different what they call the strokes in the language would bias towards particular directions that are easier to write with the hand. Like a stroke that comes down from the top would be an easier score to make than, say, like a curve that comes from the bottom and goes upwards, because you have to twist your whole hand round. So you can imagine how like rarer, and we don't know if this is an alphabetic language or if they're like
it seems to be I found a nice little table of the written symbols, and it seems to be an alphabetic language.
And then to jump ahead, because I don't want to go down through this in alphabetic order, so I'm going to jump around to ones that people might be familiar. And another claw-based language, I'm surprised it's claw-based, but it's the Gith, who feature quite prominently in Baldur's Gate 3, which, if you are less familiar with D&D but more familiar with video games, you might have played. And the Gith are kind of like an alien race. They are humanoids, but they come from another dimension. They're split into two distinct ethnicities of the kind of warlike Githyanki, who are very much like Klingons that you mentioned earlier, and the Githzerai, who are more kind of pacifist monastic people. But it says here that they have a claw-based script, but there's an interesting thing about the writing here. Where it says it's the written word of the Gith is quite unique in appearance. Each sentence is written in a circular shape, resulting in a page full of circles that can be a little difficult to read for an untrained person.
Yeah,
which is,
and we see that in the game because they have those discs.
We do, but we never see the actual script. We saw the discs, right? Yeah. And I never realized, it never shows you close up what's on the discs.
Yeah.
But it makes sense that if the sentences are circles, then the thing on which they exist would also be circles, right? And you see that. I know I'm not I have a passing interest in archaeology. That means I know this, but I don't know it about modern languages. But I know that there are spiral-based languages in, I don't know if it's the Aztecs or the Mayans. I'm going to say the Mayans, but they have words that go in a spiral. And the characters, you might have a word that just contains one character and it's just one glyph.
Yes.
And if it contains
it's
three
sort of
characters.
Pictographs is what they are.
Yeah, they're pictographs, but each one is arranged in a spiral.
Yes.
And it seems like this is that, but rounded. You know? Yeah. It's the same concept. But that's cool. I mean, I guess in the thinking of the creatives here, it's like, what's the thing that's most still recognisable as a script, but feels alien enough to us now that all modern languages are linear, right?
Yeah, but to be fair, I would assume that this is still linear. It's just not on a straight line. Yeah. So it's, I'm not sure to what degree the fact that it's in a circular shape, how that actually affects the language or how it would be read. Because I can write a sentence in a circular line as well, and that's not going to change the meaning or anything about it. So yeah, I don't know if it tells us any more than that, but
it feels like it might change how you think when you're writing, though, because you have to know the structure of the full sentence before you can start writing it. You know when you're a kid and you're like drawing a picture of like a can of baked beans or like a bottle, and you don't plan the text out properly, so you end up like I've seen kids do this time and time again in art classes, where you sort of start writing the name of a thing on a bottle, and instead of just letting the letters disappear around the corner, you sort of push them down onto them down onto the next line in a way that it just isn't in real life. So I think if you had to write in circular sentences, you would probably be thinking about your entire sentence before you put it on the page.
Does it say that it is one sentence per circle?
I think so. That's inferred. But again, I think that's what's really interesting about the approach they have here, is that you get these three little paragraphs for each language, and there's a summary, the sounds, which I guess is the phonetics and how it relates to their body.
Yeah.
And then the appearance, which is what it looks like when you just find a text that is in this. And that's you get like a couple of sentences.
They are cheating a little bit because they sort of pick out what would be a cool feature and then they put it in, but they don't really think through how would it work and what's the significance of that.
And you don't want them to really, because you want to be able to fill in the gaps yourself. So I was telling you the other day, the D&D campaign I started recently, we have a guy from Australia who's joined, and he's made his character a half orc, and we were joking around with the idea that his accent is just an orcish accent in our game, and we're going to just run with that now. So like the Australian accent in our game world is what is produced when someone from an orcish when someone from an orcish background speaks in common, they sound Australian. And
amazing.
It's Australian, which I kind of like, because there's this association with Australians because all of the stereotypes we get of Australians in like America and England are this kind of gruff, working class, woodsy kind of thing, which maps on really nicely to orcs if you're trying to make a kind of friendly orc. Whereas historically, like, orcs and goblins have been based on sort of colonial fantasies of like savage peoples that just are barbaric and stuff, and not very friendly, and it's okay to go and kill them all because they don't have souls or whatever. Obviously, like these are all things that the more you think about them, the more you just want to back away from the fantasy genre entirely. But
so it's barbecues, not barbarians.
Or somewhere in the middle. You know, I'm quite happy to hang out with some barbarians if there's a barbecue involved.
Fair enough.
But yeah, Australian is good. It's not on this list though. They don't have Australian. Oh, they do have something called Thieves' Cant. Which is an interesting concept, and I know that there are like historical examples of this, and like Cockney rhyming slang is an example of this, isn't it? So do you want to explain what a cant is, because it's spelt like can't without an apostrophe, which is very confusing. Thieves' Cant is not a language in and of itself, but can be spoken in any language. It's a way of communicating hidden messages in seemingly innocent words, gestures, actions, etc. The more familiar the speakers are with one another, the more intricate and elaborate the language becomes between them. Everything about the language is situational, making it extremely difficult to decode. So if we imagine like British gangsters in something like Peaky Blinders, or what was the Assassin's Creed called that was set in Britain?
I don't remember.
Assassin's Creed Syndicate. So when we hear Cockney rhyming slang now, it's often this jokey thing, but when you think of the words that have survived, like up the apples and pears, up the stairs, you're giving someone directions that they can use for an instruction of where something is hidden or where someone is, right? So we think of Cockney rhyming slang as just this playful...
Speaking in code. Right? It's insider jokes, but for crime. Or other reasons, right?
Or both, It's like...
Imagine even children making up, certain words that now mean a different thing because they don't want grown-ups to know what it means, right? And you just have your... Or the other way around, parents making up...
like when Marge and Homer always refer to having intercourse as snuggling in The Simpsons, right? And every generation of kids has different drug slang, so that people don't know what they're talking about. So there's a mixture of trying to actually conceal something criminal and just sort of subcultural belonging of like having an in-group because you know these words, right? I think, and there isn't an example of script on here for Thieves' Cant. But I do know, it's not really thieves, I guess, but it is... Well,
they wouldn't need a separate script. You just write whatever it is in common or whatever other language, right? Because you can...
it says
it's because it isn't a language. It is just...
a usage of language, right?
Yes, where you give words a slightly different meaning to what the conventional meaning would be.
And I guess if you think of, like, criminal language we have now, like drug slang, they are nearly all existing words, right? Like, so dope is a word that already has a meaning. Like all of those types of things. I can think of an example of script in the real world where, the hobo symbols in in America, I guess this is like Great Depression era and before
Yes.
that, where it's like vagrants leaving signs. And I guess it's what they teach you in Scouts and Girl Guides as well, but it's not the same language.
Yeah.
Because it would be weird if Girl Guides were communicating in hobo language, thieves' cant.
And you have that in Skyrim in the Thieves Guild as well. You have the symbols that you can find on houses and so on that tell you, there's a watchdog, don't go in there, or wealthy resident worth burglaring.
Yeah, which I think I didn't know about until you told me about them, and I'd already played it for like 150 hours at that point as a rogue. And yeah,
embarrassing.
Yeah, it's very embarrassing.
Yeah.
I'm not very good at being a rogue. That's why I only do it in computer games. There were some other interesting ones on the list. So you get into primordial. This is real like patchouli and kombucha time, because this is elementals, right? So they are beings that are just pure fire or pure water. So we start from the appearance. It has no script. It's older than the concept of writing. Of course it is.
Yeah.
It can be seen in the way that the sun shines through the clouds, or the way grass moves in the wind. So, okay.
Colours of the wind type shit, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The sounds. Primordial is the sound of a wave hitting the shore, of wind blowing through a valley, of mountains raising and falling, and of the sun burning its way through the sky.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pure Pocahontas stuff going on here. Is Colours of the Wind Pocahontas, or
Yes.
is it Mulan? It's the oldest language, so old that it cannot be separated out from the reality that it engulfs. The language of the elementals and all dialects of primordial, and anyone who speaks primordial can understand all of them. I really struggle with elementals as a concept in fantasy, because I can see how they're a useful thing for a wizard to be able to summon.
Yes.
And then they've just had to like do this weird lore thing of like, oh, where do they come from? Oh, they come from an elemental plane. And it's like, the idea of them being beings that need to communicate feels very strange to me, because
And they're not something you can play as a character, right?
not really, no. I mean, you get elementally aligned character types like half djinn and stuff like that, but it just always feels a bit odd to think of elementals as beings with a desire, right?
Unless they come from... I sort of imagine a different universe where they live, and in the morning the fire elemental puts on his little hat and he goes out and he says goodbye to his little fire elemental.
That's the movie. You've seen... That's the movie that's called Elemental, you're thinking.
Oh, yeah.
Which is even more troubling, because it makes even less sense. But in D&D you have the prime material plane, which is where all of the planets that look even vaguely like Earth are on. And then you have elemental planes where it is just fire, or it is just death, or it is just water, or and some of them are related to sort of concepts like order or chaos or whatever. So the idea is, if you summon a fire elemental, you're summoning a being from the elemental plane of fire. But I really struggle with... It's like when you're DMing a game of Dungeons and Dragons and there's a druid at the table, you always have this annoying improv thing you've got to do where they want to talk to animals, and they can nearly always talk to animals, and you're like, and you constantly have to frame yourself in terms of like, oh, what does a squirrel know about the world? What does it care about? And how can it have a piece of information that's useful to the players in this setting, but is filtered through the thing of like, what does the squirrel care about? So it's like, oh, the big men came and I had to abandon my acorns because the big men came and they dug up the spot where I put my acorns.
Yes.
So
Baldur's Gate tells us exactly what squirrels know and care about. Namely, this is my territory.
Yeah, exactly. They do it very well in that game. But you don't want them... You're still trying to give the players something helpful out of that interaction. So you don't want them to always just say, this is my territory, piss off, right? So it becomes a really interesting improv thing, but you can sort of do that relatively easy with an animal, because you go, oh, this animal is an omnivore, or this animal is a canine, this animal is a meat eater or a herbivore, and that's going to change their temperament and how they interact with someone, a human trying to talk to. But when I try and imagine what a fire elemental is thinking of, I just like, oh, they're just probably thinking, oh, it's too cold here. I preferred being in the place where it was hot and everywhere I looked, it just looked like more of me. You know, like it's such a weird thing to try. And I guess you're not supposed to. It's not a simulation. You're supposed to think more along the lines of what would be entertaining.
Yeah.
But I haven't quite explored that as a DM. I haven't really explored that space yet of like, what does a fire elemental have to say for itself? You know, or what does a being of pure shadow have to say for itself, except just like a really sad yawn.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe they just talk about the weather. It's kind of hot in here, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They talk about the weather as if it's like a big football match, like it's the Premier League.
Oh.
And they're like, oh yeah, water's doing all right at the moment, isn't it? There's more water around than usual.
Yeah.
And that's quite good. I might try and find a way to incorporate that. But yeah, primordial, the description of it is just like, it's kind of ridiculous. It does remind me a little bit of Earthsea, of that idea. So you get in the Ursula K. Le Guin books, Earthsea, you get this idea that magic is kind of a form of computer programming where you learn the names of things in the universe and then you can manipulate them because you know their names.
Yeah.
But it also has this very specific, like, there is no word for ocean. There are just local names for specific instances of an ocean. So it's very close to Japanese Shintoism, where you have, like, gods that are like the god of this chair or the god of this bridge.
Yes.
But the way it's describing it kind of does remind me a little bit of magic in that, where it's like it's a language that is the sound of the wind and stuff. Let's look at maybe two more. Goblin. We love Goblin. So in Baldur's Gate 3, you never hear the goblins speaking Goblin.
No, they only speak common.
Yeah, they're just little Cockney rascals. Which again is modern game designers getting around the thorny issue of the fact that goblins are always just coded as being like Aboriginal peoples from non-European or like Bronze Age European kind of ancestors. But they make them all Cockney. So you've got all of these tiny little Tom Hardys. Showing up going, oh, give us your stuff, we're goblins. It's another...
Was that your best Cockney impression?
Yeah, that was... Well, I was trying to imagine what Tom Hardy would sound like if you miniaturised him and his vocal cords. Goblins are another claw-based script, which is... I don't really think of them as having claws.
I don't like this with the Gith as well, because they have... hands and fingers that they can move in a way that they could hold a tool, which if you're a bird, I can see that might be difficult, and therefore they're using their claws, right? But it gives them a sort of animalistic, not quite sophisticated.
Yeah, and the Gith are supposed to be these sort of like ancient alien kind of... They're not supposed to have that kind of primitive quality.
No, they have the technology.
Although I can imagine them doing their claw-based script in quite a flouncy way, you know.
Well, they do it in a circle, apparently.
Yeah, but I think claw is just the baseline here. It is interesting though that they've got a variety of claw-based scripts. It's not just a particular type of creature. Yeah. So Goblin is spoken by all goblinoids, which includes hobgoblins and the bugbear. Bugbears are like big, tall, hairy goblins. It's a very throat-heavy language with a great deal of hissing noises.
Okay, well, which are two different things, right?
Yeah, but I guess it's jumping up and down between the things, right?
Hissing is like a thing that happens with your tongue, mostly. Putting your tongue in a certain place and then...
It says it can be very difficult to understand, especially as it's generally spoken at very low volumes and is easily covered up by other noises in the surrounding area. So we've got the idea of it being very guttural and then, like, I guess it's like taking the English language and splitting up those elements and pushing them further in each direction.
Yeah.
So the sibilance is like really hissy and everything else is very like guttural.
Yeah. Glottal. Yeah.
Or down here, like a turkey. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a turkey language. not
Turkish.
Not Turkish like the animal turkey. It says it's probably the simplest of all the written languages, constructed of very simple scratches. It's hard to express any real depth of meaning in the written word, and most goblins will opt to write in common instead. I guess the thing I would map that onto would be like the hobo symbols we were talking about before, where it's almost like the writing is just there to express an instruction.
Basic things.
It's not like... Wasn't there a book of goblin poetry that we found in Baldur's Gate 3 at some point?
Did we? I don't remember.
I'm gonna find one and read it. But yeah, I don't think the goblin poetry book was probably written in common, because it just said that you can't express stuff in. They're sort of written as limericks in a silly kind of Cockney. It's even written in phonetic Cockney, so he is E and stuff.
Yeah.
I once met a wizard in Tama who went and corrected me grammar. He said, I can't cast no spell till I enunciate it well, so I beat him to death with a hammer.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So the goblin part of the poetry is just that it was written by a goblin, but in common.
Yeah.
Right.
And not just common, but like Cockney common, whatever that is meant to indicate.
Australian, this is the...
Yeah. You've got Australian, and then you've got Goblin Cockney, which is like Globney or something.
Sure.
And the second one is only 3 lines long. Mm-hmm. I just had to count. It is a haiku. It's written as a haiku.
Okay.
What we got here, boys? Ha! Book of poems, he says. Privy roll, more like. I won't read the third one.
It's quite sophisticated if they can do limericks and haikus, right?
Yeah. And that was, one goblin had written a poem, and then another goblin had written another poem underneath it. So in a way, that book of poems is also like an epistolary novel. Yeah. In its own way. We've got Elvish.
Boring.
Let's not talk about Elvish. I mean, Dwarfish, it kind of has a lot of the qualities you might expect. Guess what the script is based on? Based on all of the dwarf tropes.
Chiseled.
It is chiseled, yeah, of course. And we know that writing with chisels produces particular types of shapes, right? Which is, it's why Roman numerals are the shapes they are.
It can, but then think of hieroglyphs, which are at times chiseled into
so it says
solid mass.
I suppose, Roman numerals are very, very straight, and that would have been quicker.
Yes.
To do with a chisel. Dwarfish looks quite blocky, as the primary method of writing for dwarves is into stone, using elaborate chisels and stamps.
Yeah, makes sense.
It's full of hard consonants and guttural sounds. It sounds best when spoken by those with deep, booming voices, as to be heard over the loud noises of stoneworking, as well as over great distances.
Yeah,
so
I imagine it as a sort of rumbly language.
Yeah. I think that's interesting that we get this tiny little, ethnographic vignette in that description of, you need to have a booming voice for dwarfish because people are going to be stoneworking nearby.
Yeah.
I think that's really fun. It's it's only 2 sentences, but they crammed so much into it. And no sense of anything else apart from it's people with deep voices speak this language.
Yeah.
There's no, it's like a Scandinavian language or it's like Russian or whatever. It's just whatever you imagine it to be, as long as it has this fancy quality that maps it onto these small people that live underground.
Yeah. So as we said in the beginning, there's nothing about the structure of the actual language and what the grammatical features might be like, which is fine.
Yeah, it's very much how everything in D&D works. There's they give you these very broad strokes things that you can project your own thing onto. So if you decide that all of your halflings are going to be from Cornwall or the West Country in England and have that particular accent, there's nothing in a rule book that says you can't. So they give you rules and law that you can ignore, but they also give you rules and law that are deliberately vague in the first place so that there's space for you to be creative or to, you know, project your own mappings from the real world onto things like Australian. And then it makes it easier to relate to what's going on in the world. And I think as a DM, it also makes some of your kind of creative stuff quicker. Because then I go, oh, Australian, okay, we meet a random half-orc, they're going to be called Bruce. Or we meet a couple of half-orcs, they're going to be called Bruce and Sheila.
Yeah.
And then later down the line, I'm gonna be like, oh no, I've used up all 2 of my Australian names. I need to get my Australian baby names dictionary out. And I think it's an interesting example. Like some of the other games that we might look at on this podcast will have a much more structured approach to doing a constructed language.
Yes.
So, for example, when we played Heaven's Fault, that is a language that is very literally constructed.
Yes, because it is the focus of the game.
Yes, and like the whole game is based around you deconstructing it. And the thing that's so cool about it, spoiler alert if you haven't played that game, is that there is no definitive right translation that exists outside of the game as far as we're aware. It's like it's all inferred through the gameplay, and you can, but I mean it's a whole episode in its own right? But I guess what I'm gesturing at is because D&D as a game needs to do particular things in terms of player creativity, it does have this approach to language which is just like, it just kind of gives you a blob of flavour to work with. And it gives you those key things of like, here's the script, here's what it might look like if you come across it. And that's really cool because you can have player characters that don't know. There's always a bit of dramatic irony in D&D in the gap of knowledge between what the players are supposed to know and what the player characters know.
Yeah.
So you can have player characters happen upon a script that's made with clause, and the players might be able to intuit from that and what they know about the game and the universe what that language is, even if they can't read it. But then the player characters might not know anything. They'll just be like, oh, there's some weird scratch marks on the wall. And you're always playing around with that gap between like what the players know and what the player characters know, whereas some of the other things we'll look at will be much more explicit in how they've constructed the language in the game.
I think that is going to be the one that we do next, I guess, is Heaven's Vault.
Okay.
Yeah.
It'd be just decided that that's the one we're going to do next.
Yeah.
Which is probably a good idea because I'm not sure I can make myself play it again, but we do need to talk about it before I forget.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've played it 1.5 times.
I've played it 3 times.
Which is the way that they facilitate that is interesting, and we can talk about that another time. But thanks for listening to Say It Like You Play It, the podcast about games, languages, and culture. I've been Dr. Joe. Thanks for listening to us talk about the languages of Dungeons and Dragons, some of which appear in Baldur's Gate 3. So I'll probably put that in the title because more people will click on the podcast if it says Baldur's Gate 3 in the title. Yeah, this is a very early episode of the podcast. And if you like what you heard and you want to hear more of it, you can help us out a lot by leaving a review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on, because that can be really helpful in terms of getting other people to see it who might have the same interests as you. Alternatively, you can find someone who likes games, languages and culture, and you can recommend it to them.
Yeah.
You could be like, hey, Agatha.
They use words.
I'm trying to come up with a name. Hey, Brunhilde. I know you like games, languages and culture, and you'd like to hear some people who are ostensibly smart talk about that for half an hour. Here's this podcast, and then you send it to them and they can listen and enjoy it, and then hopefully they'll do the same thing.
Send it back to you and say...
Well, hopefully they send it to a different person, you know. I'm hoping for like a kind of branching network.
Like those
That's how virality
90s Cheyne emails.
Yeah, like a 90s chain email. So yeah, like that's the model of virality I'm thinking of. I think when you think of them just sending it back, that's more like two people are in a room and every couple of days one person coughs and infects the other person, and then the other person coughs back 3 days later.
Yeah.
That's not really virality. That's like just two people. We would prefer something much more widespread.
Yeah, at least 3 people, ideally.
So I know it's a niche set of things, but I'm pretty sure there are enough geeks out there who are into.
There are people who have heard of a language.
Yeah, and just
maybe use one occasionally.
Yeah, probably more than one, even without realizing it. You know, they might occasionally use French words in English, as we are wont to do when we
speak English,
when we go for a rendezvous, or or just
let's not get into the history of English and how French it is.
But just to have a very brief peek behind the curtain, Ibby is a linguist, a practicing linguist. What does that mean? Do you go up to people and say, "What's your language"?
No, it means, well, I study in particular language use rather than language structure. So I look at how people use language in everyday communication to achieve certain goals. And in particular, what that means for the sort of relationships people have with each other. How does who we speak to affect how we speak to the people, and the other way around, how does how we speak to people affect our relationships?
So it's concepts like manners and that sort of stuff all falls in that category of
broadly things like politeness, impoliteness, interpersonal conflict, to what degree can we persuade other people to do things we want them to do or convince them of things, that kind of thing.
But no research directly related to games.
No.
Whereas I'm the opposite end, where I do have an academic background, which is in cultural studies. And cultural studies is a bit of a mishmash of things, but my background in cultural studies contains elements of sociology and elements of psychology, most of which were in my research related to games and the making of games. And I've temporarily left all that behind because I've been working in the games industry for a couple of years. And this podcast for me is a way for us to have interesting conversations about games which are a shared interest between us, but to also force me to use that bit of my brain that doesn't work anymore, but used to handle long words. Like, I mean, I can't even think of a long word right now because I haven't said one in such a long time. It was quite hard to say sociology a minute ago.
Yeah.
I was like, what was that? I remember that thing. It's where you it's where you see a bunch of people doing stuff and you're like, oh, how does that work? Nowadays I just think about that in terms of video games and how do you get people to buy little gems and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So hopefully it will be a helpful exercise. So depending on who's listening to this, if they're in grad school or they're reading big people books, they might be more on the IBI side of things, of like you're actually regularly reading academic work, whereas I'm just working on games and then occasionally I remember this before time in the time the elemental plane of big words when I went there briefly.
No.
Okie dokie.
Let's stand up by the